Arnie's in the new Terminator. He's back, man.
He's back.
Yeah, he's back.
Well, where do you go when you give up politics? You just go straight back to being the Terminator, right?
Back to the place where people loved you.
Yeah.
So I've read a number of EPKs and IMDb, which is actually kind of not the best place to go for information on New Zealand films. But I want to actually get from you, what is this documentary about?
Okay. Ever the Land is a feature documentary. I would say it's a pretty immersive experience of people's relationship with land, and the film looks at that specifically via the story and journey of Tūhoe towards building the first living building in New Zealand.
Yeah. Now, was that always the story you were willing to tell from the very start about this merging of the living building and the Ngāi Tūhoe community?
I mean, the architecture or that particular project was always tied up with Tūhoe. So they were the ones that were going to build this building, their first tribal headquarters in, I believe, over 150 years. So that was something very significant that sort of triggered my interest, but actually rather the whole thing about the living building challenge, which is an architectural philosophy that's come out of the States and is a very, very regenerative and highly sustainable architecture. So yeah, this was the first project of its kind in New Zealand, and Tūhoe happened to be the one leading the way.
Now, typically when a film, at least in New Zealand, it mixes in with a lot of cultural relevance. Some people can feel a bit iffy about the filmmakers involved, but what makes you a great choice to tell this story for the Tūhoe community?
I think that's a question for Tūhoe, to be honest. I mean, so when I say we, this is the producer Alexander Beasy and I. We're both German. We met over here in New Zealand. We didn't know each other back in Germany, and I came over 4 years ago, and Alex, I think, has been in New Zealand for 9 years. He's done a few stories and documentaries for Māori television before, so he's built quite a relationship with Māori filmmakers. So when this project came on the table, you know, I think we were the only ones putting up our hands at the time, you know, and saying, look, approaching Tūhoe and saying, we're keen to find out more and we're interested in doing this. So it wasn't so much, you know, as an interviewer trying to push us forward as being the right filmmakers. I think it was Tūhoe, you know, giving us the opportunity and showing us the trust to be able to come in. They very much make their own decisions. So from that point of view, I think we felt very, you know, secure that we're okay in doing what we're doing, just by virtue of them saying, yes, you know, we'll give you the permission to do that.
So how long do you think it took for you to build up this trust with that community?
It was interesting. I felt we had a very open and trusting relationship with them right from the start. So how it worked was Alex and I introduced ourselves to the architects, first of all. I mean, that was our first point of connection where we heard about this project. And then as soon as they said, look, you know, we're sort of at an early design stage, now would be the time to come on board, introduce ourselves. We pretty much just got the introduction through the lead architect, Ivan Mersip. We're invited to a design meeting that they had, and from day one we were allowed to roll the cameras. It was pretty open doors, and you know, we did a few interviews then and there with Tamati Kruger, who at the time was the chief negotiator of Tūhoe. And I think, you know, we just kind of put the right foot forward at all times, and you know, we're quite respectful and being very open and plain that we didn't know much about, you know, their history, and coming with quite a blank canvas to them, which I think was something in hindsight that I think they really appreciated, that we didn't come with preconceived ideas.
And a willingness to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So how long was the shoot in total?
Filming period was 2 years. So the first year being mainly sort of the design stage of the project, but it was also where I think for me as a filmmaker the focus of the film shifted a bit. And where I first heard about the story, I thought it was really going to be very purely about the architecture. I mean, that was my hook, that was my connection to the story. And then I got to spend a lot of time there with Tūhoe and, you know, on the land and the different communities, and I realised that really to understand the building and what it means and the whole philosophy of it, I needed to capture also the different stories and realities that I found on the ground and just the presence of the place and the land.
So when you made that shift to not just focus on the building, did you also have to shift your filmmaking tactics?
A little bit. I would say probably the first 6 or 7 months were in a way research, to be honest. You know, I sort of came very fresh and blank to the project. So we did a lot of interviews, but then I kind of knew along the way that I didn't really want to use interviews in the film. Sort of as soon as I got a feel for the place and understood how much it is about the presence of Te Urewera, their ancestral homelands, and being really personally quite taken by the sounds, the sights, the smells, and feeling that was something I wanted to capture as purely as possible, I sort of then shifted to having quite a more quiet approach to the filming. Example, I used to shoot a lot of handheld in the beginning, and at some point I said, look, actually I think I just need to have a fixed camera and see what happens unfold off in front of the camera and sort of get into the rhythm of things as they happen then and there.
Yeah, because you're also the cinematographer for the film, and given you're having two tasks, did it make it easier or more difficult being the DOP as well as the director?
I think there's two sides to it. With documentary, you mainly, I find, directing yourself, especially if it's an observational documentary. And I found it helped that I didn't have one extra step in terms of communicating to someone what I was seeing and what I was interested in, because so much is about subtle things and seeing something in the corner of your eye that you're suddenly interested in or that you're anticipating to happen. At the same time, of course, it's tricky and challenging if you're doing everything on your own. Sound on top of it, sometimes we'd have people mic'd up and something was, rustling and you're just kind of wearing 3 or 4 hats at the same time. But overall, I think it helped in terms of the intimacy of the scenes that we captured and the relationship that I was able to build with the people.
So how many people were actually on your crew during filming?
1. Just myself and myself.
Wow, many hats.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a ridiculous visual when I think about it. So, given that you were on the ground floor when this story was occurring, were you ever worried of running the risk that you wouldn't have this story develop in a way that would be that interesting to work as a feature film?
Yeah, I think that worry was definitely, to some degree, always lurking in the back of my head, more in that as I started shifting my focus away from purely the architecture, I felt the story was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And the settlements started happening alongside, and it became a really sort of integral part of what I was interested in and what I felt needed to be captured and somehow, layered into the film as well. But probably throughout filming, I didn't yet have a fully clear picture of what the film should look like. I always knew what it should feel like and the kind of things I wanted to get across in terms of a sense and a mood. But knowing exactly how the pieces would fit together, that really just came at the editing stage. So certainly many times throughout, I thought this thing was bigger than me and everything else.
Would you say that you made this film for an international audience, or you had an international audience in mind, or is this more for New Zealanders specifically?
I think it's for both. I think with mine and Alex's connection to overseas and our roots being in Germany, we always had that hat on as well to see, okay, look, would there be an international audience for this? And I suppose our perspective coming in as outsiders as perhaps, also an international perspective on the story. Of course, we see things a little bit different as to someone who grew up here and sort of been following the history and things that have been going on with Tūhoe for a long time. So I think it plays to both audiences. I mean, that was something interesting to consider in the editing. How much can you expect people to know? But even there, we were quite surprised sort of when we sort of test screened, even to New Zealand audiences, sometimes how little people knew about a particular history in their own country, and I'm guilty of that too, with my own history back home. But it was definitely something we always needed to check. How much can we expect, even a New Zealand's audience, to know about this story and about the history of Tūhoe?
We're living in a pretty good age for documentaries and documentarians. One thing I really want to get your perspective on is how do you make a documentary artistic as opposed to a National Geographic ball fest?
Artistic, hey? I don't know. I think you just stay genuine to your own voice. You ideally have the space and time to find out what the story wants to be as well. I mean, we struggled with funding at the beginning of the film, so probably the first year and a half, it was pretty much a labour of love.
Well, what was your budget, if I can ask?
Do you want a number?
Maybe an approximation?
It was probably about 300,000 all in all, and you have to count into that sort of in kind, so our own equipment, editing facilities that we would have, our own camera gear and stuff, so obviously that falls off, but if you count it all in, that's probably about the ballpark that we worked with. But yeah, coming back to sort of either having to do something where you immediately have the pressure of funding and what your funders expect, and the sort of the question that forever is, who's your audience, and what do they want to see. It's very tricky, and also documentary doesn't allow for that. You have to be open to let things happen as they do.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're able to get more funding. Mm-hmm. How were you able to? I want to say convinced, but I don't know if that's a bad word. But screw it. How did you convince them to give you more funding?
I think generally with funding, people want to see something nowadays, a rough cut of some sort or a good pitching trailer. So, when you're just starting out and you haven't got anything and all you do is kind of write something in a treatment and real life is probably going to take it somewhere else from the page anyway, that's the hard bit to convince people, and I understand that. So as soon as we had done a little bit of filming and were able to put a pitching trailer together and then later on a rough cut, that's when, we saw some dollars.
Okay, and did this take place before or after the shift to make it more about the community as well as the building?
Probably after, definitely after we've spent more time there and I suppose got a little bit more to the heart of the story.
So that's when the feet of the story actually got its shoes on at that point?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sarah,
okay.
And all the best. I haven't actually seen the film, by the way, but I will be there at the world premiere in an actual cinema rather than by myself in my bedroom with a DVD screen.
Lovely. Thank you, Liam.
Yeah.
Nice.
Welcome.
You were doing really well.